Good evening. I'm Jim White, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at UNC Chapel Hill. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Abbey Speaker Series event, Is Liberal Democracy in Danger? The Abbey Speaker Series is hosted by UNC's Program for Public Discourse, which seeks to build our students' capacities for debate and deliberation and to foster a culture of constructive dialogue about issues of national importance at UNC and beyond. 4 times each year, the Abbey Speaker Series brings together experts from different fields and disciplines to showcase productive dialogue on timely issues across a range of perspectives. On behalf of the university, I would like to thank the Abbey family for helping bring us such important programming to campus. Tonight's event will be a sober conversation about liberal democracy. With authoritarianism on the rise globally, it is important for Americans to consider how their institutions have resisted such challenges before and how citizens today can protect democratic values like free speech and fair elections. Tonight's panelists have different perspectives about the threats to political institutions, both past and present. They share, however, a commitment to respectful discussion of contentious issues. I want to remind the audience that the views expressed by panelists do not necessarily reflect that of the university or sponsoring programs. And I want to also thank you all for joining us tonight. I will now turn the program over to Sarah Truell, Faculty Director of the Program for Public Discourse. Sarah?
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. And thank you, Jim, for the introduction. As the faculty director of the Program for Public Discourse, I want to thank both the Carolina alumni and the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics program for co-sponsoring this program tonight. Our panelists bring different perspectives and camaraderie to tonight's event. Richard Ebeling and Michael Meeropol debated each other many years ago, and we are excited to bring them together again to continue the conversation. Richard Ebeling is professor of economics at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. He is recognized as one of the leading members of the Austrian School of Economics, a school of thought which analyzes economic activity by focusing on autonomous individual choices. Professor Ebeling has also served as president of the Foundation for Economic Education and the Society for the Development of Austrian Economics. Michael Meeropol is professor emeritus of economics at Western New England University, where he also served as department chair. He is the son of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, the only American couple ever executed by the United States for conspiracy to commit espionage. His publications include We Are Your Sons, The Legacy of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, co-authored with his brother, Robert. Graham Robertson, professor of political science and director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies here at UNC, was planning on moderating this evening's event. But unfortunately, an emergency is preventing him from being here. If you are interested, though, in Graham's thoughts on tonight's event, he gave an excellent interview with Aaron Keck on 97.9 The Hill, where you can read many of his thoughts, particularly from the global perspective, on this evening's program. Moderating in Graham's place, we are incredibly fortunate to welcome Michael Morgan, Associate Professor of History here at UNC, where he specializes in modern international and global history. He is the author of The Final Act, The Helsinki Accords and the Transformation of the Cold War, which received the 2018 Edgar S. Furness Award for the best first book in international security. In addition to his primary appointment in history, Professor Morgan is an adjunct professor in the School for Civic Life and Leadership, the Curriculum in Peace, War, and Defense, and the Curriculum in Global Studies. He is busy. A professional recording of this panel will be available afterward. Please do not record or take photographs during the panel this evening. We will take questions from the audience beginning at 6:30. During this time, please raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone to ask your question. And now I turn the conversation over to Mike. Thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to all of you for being with us this evening for what I hope will be a stimulating and I'm sure a very important conversation. Before we get into it, I'd just like to let all of you know that we will have time for audience questions around 6:30 p.m. So over the course of the discussion, give some thought to any questions you'd like to pose to our two distinguished guests. In order to set the terms of our debate this evening, or our discussion, I should say, and of course our question is, Is liberal democracy in danger? I thought it might be useful to start by asking both of you to define those terms. What is liberal democracy, and what is liberalism?
If you don't mind, I guess I'll start since I'm older. I would say that the most important thing about liberal democracy is the idea, it goes right back to the Declaration of Independence. Governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. We, the people, get to consent to what the government is going to do. Now, in a constitutional republic based on representative democracy, we get to vote for our representatives. And liberal democracy advanced dramatically from 1789, when a tiny percentage of white men had the right to vote, to today when, except for certain convicted felons, anybody over 18 of any color, of any gender, who is a citizen has the right to vote. So first of all, the first step, it seems to me, is the widespread franchise. The second step, and this is, there's nothing special or specific about this, it's the rights of the Bill of Rights must be protected. You can't convince somebody to vote for you if you don't have the freedom to speak so they can hear you. And so all the rights in the Bill of Rights are absolutely essential elements of what we would call liberal democracy. So when you hear politicians and journalists talk about our democracy, that to me is what they're talking about. Now, it's not as simple as that, because every once in a while, rights can be in conflict, and I'm sure we'll end up exploring that. But if you want to, in my opinion, a basic definition of liberal democracy, it is those rights, the rights of the Bill of Rights, and the right to vote, the right to determine who is going to make the rules by which you live.
Okay, I perhaps want to express the same thing, but in a slightly different way. What is democracy? It is ruled by the people. Through most of human history, rule by the people was the exception and not the rule. Through most of human history, there were tribal chieftains, there were absolute monarchs, there were aristocracies who controlled society, so it was the few over the many. And it took a very long time, and really only in modern history, that there emerged a reverse system of the majority, or the people as a whole, having a say over the decision-making of their government, and as Michael was just saying, the election of the representatives who would then be holding office for a stipulated period of time before another regularized election, and reflecting the views that the voters had in their decision-making and voting while in office. But we need to remember that unless there's a modifier, democracy can have a dark side as well as a positive side. And that is, democracy can be unlimited, which means the majority can do anything they want. The most classic example of this is ancient Athens and the story of Socrates. Socrates was put on trial in the city-state of Athens for having been accused of corrupting the youth of the community, for having them ask questions, well, why do we respect and follow these traditions and customs? Why do you do what your parents tell you? And he insisted that he was not saying that these were wrong, but he felt that it's better to think about why you hold these views than not. But that went against the grain, and a trial was held, and out of a jury of 501 people, of the free citizens of Athens, 280 found him guilty, and he drank the hemlock. That's the danger of an unlimited democracy, where the will of the majority has no restraint, including over life and death. The modifier, as I see it, is that throughout history, matching the attempt to restrain monarchs and aristocracies has been the desire to limit the power of government itself. And that is what the history of liberalism has been about, particularly in its modern era. The idea that it's not enough that the people vote, but the people themselves should place restraints on themselves, that there are certain rights inherent in being a human being that even all minus one could not infringe upon. So if some one person said things or wrote things or believed things that you didn't agree with, even though it was all of you versus him, as the First Amendment of the Constitution says, Congress shall pass no law abridging freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of free association and assembly. That means that there are restraints even on majorities. And without that, not only are people not free, but the system cannot work, as Michael is suggesting. How can you talk about a democratic discourse if people can't speak their own mind? Even if you find what they say wrong and even repugnant. But that is the basis of it. Liberal democracy is the modifier that talks about the rights of the individual in the setting of voting, but which sets restraints and limits on what even the majority could do.
And we might as well, since we're in North Carolina, I understand that almost every North Carolina high school student knows about the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. That was a majority activity. The majority white population burned the black newspaper, forced the elected officials to leave town, murdered 30 to 300 people, and established white supremacy in North Carolina that was not defeated until approximately 1980 or 1970. So the majority can sometimes do terrible, terrible mischief. And since you know about my family background, we have learned enough to know that in the days of the 1950s, when the majority sentiment was that anybody who was a communist was a grave danger, the majority of people, I'm sorry to say this, they cheered when my parents were executed. There was a small group of people who demonstrated against it, and there was a lot of effort to get President Eisenhower to change the plans. But this is an example of the tyranny of the majority. And that's where, as Richard said, the rules of behavior, including, for example, the rules of due process, the rules of the right to appeal in the courts, all these rules are absolutely essential so that, yes, majority can rule, but there can be no tyranny of the majority. And I will leave it with, there's a contradiction in what I just said, and the borderline between the rights of the majority and the tyranny of the majority is where tremendous disagreements occur. You may be introduced to some of that later tonight, for all we know.
Thanks. That's a great introduction, I think, to our topic to set the terms of debate. So I think now we can move to the question at hand, which is the threats to liberal democracy. Why should undergraduates, American citizens in general, worry about the state of liberal democracy? Why is liberal democracy valuable? Why is it something that it's worth talking about, worrying about, and defending?
You raised the point.
Okay. Well, I think that the importance for you as the next generation here is the fact that ask yourself the question if you did not have a form of a liberal democracy. My wife is Russian. She grew up in the Soviet Union. Her grandfather spent 10 years in the Gulag prisons. People were oppressed, people were denied their liberty, people were tortured and executed, and people had no such rights at all. Nazi Germany, the other totalitarian example of the 20th century. Here, the individuals were censored, surveilled, rounded up, put in camps, mass murdered. The individual had no rights in law. The individual had no guarantees of his freedom of his life, his liberty, and the accompanying freedoms of speech, of the press, of association, of being secure in his papers and his possessions against unwarranted search or seizure. Do you want to live in a society in which you have to worry whether, like Soviets did for decades, will there be a knock on the door in the middle of the night and the secret police will take you away and you will not know what your fate is going to be and your family members may never know what happened to you? Those protections in the Bill of Rights and the traditions, the customs, the respect, the legacy of the spirit of the Constitution and this liberal democratic culture is vital if you don't want to be in a terror society.
And we should also remember that in the Jim Crow South, that was what life was like for black people for decades. The danger of lynching. And if you were lynched and they actually tried to arrest the perpetrators, an all-white jury would acquit you. That happened in the 1950s when the murderers of Emmett Till were acquitted and then told their stories to Look magazine, explaining how they killed the young man. And of course, our rules are good for bad guys as well as good guys. The rule against double jeopardy, which is a great thing for people, ended up allowing these murderers to get away with it and flaunt the fact that they had murdered that young man to a nationwide readership in Look magazine. So that's the problem. If you run afoul of a system where the protections of the Bill of Rights do not apply to you, then you are in trouble. And of course, a lot of people would say, well, that's not going to be me, but it might be you.
It sounds like you've identified some common ground between you. Both of your responses emphasized the centrality and the sanctity of the individual and individual liberty. That's the key thing that liberal democracy is set up to protect. Is that fair? Is that a fair description of your views?
Well, I have to confess, I come from a tradition where the freedom of individuals to own wealth-producing property gives you inordinate power. And it actually, in my opinion, undermines many elements of democracy. I come from the tradition of Marxist economics. I am not an apologist for the Soviet Union by any means, because I think Marx himself probably would have been hauled off to the gulag. But the idea that ownership of wealth-producing property gives you power over other people is a potential problem for liberal democracy. And I know that the individualistic tradition argues that the rights to private property owners are just as important as the rights to life and liberty. So I think there is a bit of a disagreement, which is one of the reasons why I am a little bit more sympathetic to the post-FDR version of liberalism, which involves government intervention, government regulations, government macroeconomic policy, all sorts of things that depart from 19th century liberalism.
Professor Abbey?
There's no guarantee of liberty without the right to private property. Every socialist experiment in the 20th century that abolished private property left the individual at the mercy and control of the state. Private property gives you an area of autonomy and liberty that under constitutional restraints are realized and the state cannot abridge or violate. It gives you areas in which you can say what you want, live the way you want, do the things you want, in free voluntary relationship and exchange and association with others outside of the power of the state. There is no greater danger than when the state reaches the ability to control your means of livelihood. The single employer, the single provider of income, the single determiner of the place you live, the income you have, the things you can buy. Your entire fate is in the hands of the government. The advantage of a real competitive private enterprise, free market economy is that it depoliticizes all this. In my opinion, the market economy is the true democracy. It is the pluralistic democracy in which each of us freely associate with our neighbors for employment, what we want to buy, how we want to invest, how we want to live our lives. And you go your way and I go mine. And it removes the tensions and the conflicts when everything becomes politicized. Let me give one example. Governments run schooling. It's public schooling, but it's basically government schooling. For decades, what have been the fights? Well, will little kiddies say the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of the day or not? Will they learn creationism or evolution in their biology class? Will they learn that there is only a mommy and a daddy, or that Sally can have two dads and Bobby can have two moms, or some Baskin-Robbins in-between flavors of genders? That tension is there because the fight is over who's going to control the Board of Education, because it's compulsory attendance with one curriculum for all. Imagine that education was privatized. You send your kid to the school you want, I send the school to I want. There's diversity. There's competition of methods of curriculum, methods of learning, and methods of ideas, as opposed to this homogenization of it. When I grew up, Christopher Columbus was a hero. He discovered America, and then you see the smokestacks of industrialized America and happy Americans. Now what is taught? Oh, Columbus was a bad man. He brought diseases, he mistreated the Native Americans. But why? Because this is a monopoly curriculum. It shouldn't be monopolized to control people's minds, to make you good, obedient citizens and accept the values and ideas that the government wants you to have. And in a democracy, precisely because people can influence this, they have to have monopoly control of these things. That's why all of these things should be taken out of the hands of the government. And you have the pluralistic democracy of freedom of choice and diversity that the market gives you.
Richard, as you know, before 1964, the market gave all people who ran public accommodations in the South the right to discriminate. And that right to discriminate on the part of those businesses curtailed desperately the rights of people with the wrong skin color. Now, what did it take to end that? It took a national government with a law which limited the rights of those private businesses, and it upheld the rights of those individuals. Now, this is not an argument for government taking over businesses. This is an argument for government regulating businesses, because when you have a business, you have tremendous power. If you run a corporation, if you are a CEO of a corporation and you have 1,000 employees, you can tell them how to dress. On your private property, you have the right to shoot somebody on that private property and get away with it if you say, oh, I feared for my life. It's a kid in a Halloween costume on your doorstep who's knocking on the door and scares you. You shoot him and you're free. Private property is the potential for tremendous abuse, and that's why we have laws that restrict private property. The Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, and I won't make 59 examples, but the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, made it illegal to run a business where there was not a ramp so a wheelchair could get up, where there was not a bathroom big enough for the accommodation of the wheelchair. These restricted the rights of those business people, but it opened a tremendous rights for everybody in the country with disabilities. And I will remind everybody, it was a Republican president, George H.W. Bush, that signed and celebrated the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. So there's where we do definitely disagree about the boundaries of true liberal democracy.
Segregation was imposed by the local state governments here. You couldn't serve blacks in your restaurant. You couldn't have blacks in your hotels. You couldn't have blacks working equally with whites on the same shop floor. The states down here prohibited it. It was the state that was the imposer of segregation. All that had to be done was eliminate the segregation laws. Why was there apartheid in South Africa? Why were blacks prohibited from certain living areas, certain professions, occupations, certain ways of livelihood? Because white workers did not want the competition of blacks. They used the state to impose restrictions on limiting access to employment on the basis of color as a privilege and a special interest for themselves, the same way as in the South. The state did these impositions. All you needed to do was eliminate them. Now, so would some people have continued to discriminate? Quite so. But you see, one of the costs of freedom is the right for people to do things you don't approve of. Now, I'm going to make a statement here. Let us suppose that some of you view yourselves as Democrats or as progressives. How many conservative friends do you have that you invite over to dinner? I doubt very few. You discriminate. You discriminate on the basis of politics and ideology. And you probably don't even pay much attention to their views. Trust me, I know conservatives who are just the exact same. The fact is part of the price of the free society is the right to associate and interact with people who you don't want to associate with. The state should neither have forced segregation nor forced integration, but the freedom of association. You know, in the marketplace, Michael was suggesting something. In the marketplace, ultimately, only one color matters, the color of your money. You could refuse to hire a black person where the state is not infringing and forcing you not to. But what if it's a qualified, skilled worker, and you allow your prejudice not to hire him or to fire him? Well, there's going to be some other employer who cares more about what the fellow can contribute to the bottom line than what he looks like. You could refuse to serve some people in your place of business, but those are customers you lose, and there's going to be someone else who says, why should I care about that? I'm just more interested in maximizing my revenue and my market share. And as a consequence, over time, that will tend to minimize and reduce these things. The market is the great conciliator, and in fact is the basis of both inclusion and diversity.
I think
You don't want us to keep going.
we've established, we're off to a great start. We've established some points of common ground, as well as, I think, some points of sharp disagreement between you. Now that we've had the discussion about economics and political theory, I'd like to draw us towards what's happening today. And the central question for our discussion this evening, which is, what are the threats? Do you see threats to liberal democracy in the United States today? And where do those threats come from?
If you want to let me go first, I would be happy to.
Yeah.
I hate to recommend reading, especially reading something that's 900 pages long, but Project 2025 is, in my personal opinion, an unbelievable threat to individual rights and long-term rights. I can give you a handful of examples, but the most important thing, I would say, is that beginning with the Supreme Court ruling in Shelby County, the Voting Rights Act, which was probably one of the most important advances in democratic rights since the 14th and 15th Amendments, because if this was an example not of ordering businesses what to do, but of stopping governments from devising methods from keeping people to vote, from voting. And the Voting Rights Act worked. It worked very dramatically. And the Supreme Court, in its non-wisdom, decided in the Shelby County ruling, which occurred in 2013, that the South had changed sufficiently that when they made changes in voting rights, you shouldn't immediately assume they're trying to discriminate against blacks. And so that section of the Voting Rights Act was ruled unconstitutional. The result was a tremendous increase in voter suppression laws. The Brennan Center for Justice has documented it very dramatically. Lots of people have been kicked off the voting center rolls. There are a whole host of recommendations within Project 2027. For example, they want the Department of Health and Human Services to define a fertilized egg as a person. And therefore, IVF is now murder. And therefore, anybody who commits an abortion anytime is committing murder. And they want the Secretary of Health and Human Services to check on when women travel from a state that bans abortion to a state that allows abortion, what did they do when they get to that state? We are getting to a modern version, and I'm sorry to be hyperbolic about this, of the Fugitive Slave Act. If Project 2025 is beginning to be enacted, and they're ready to do it, I think the United States will be going down a very, very dark hole. That's my view of at least some of the threats, and I could go on with other examples.
I'll say that this is a perfect example of the point I was making. Why is there this conflict? Well, what is the Department of Health and Welfare going to say in Washington, D.C.? Is it going to rule X or is it going to rule Y? And do you like the X rule or do you like the Y rule? And if it does one or the other and you don't agree with it, then you're put in a difficult situation of having legal impositions that you radically disagree with. There shouldn't be a Department of Health and Welfare. Leave these matters to the private choices and decisions of individuals. The state should not be involved in whether you have kids, how you have kids, whether you want, you own your body, okay? This is the most sacrosanct property right. Your private property is your body. No one is to touch it, no one is to attempt to rule it, no one is to try to invasively attack it without your consent. Do away with these government bureaus and agencies and you depoliticize it. And there wouldn't be an argument. Well, is that going to be the rule that everyone has to match up to or the other rule? And you don't have to then be forced in your general taxes to fund things that you may find morally repugnant or just culturally undesirable.
Yeah, so basically, what I hear you saying, Richard, is that the root of the problem is not people who are trying to get the government to take away your rights. The root of the problem is the initial government power to define your rights. That's what I hear you saying. Am I right?
It's the attempt of the government to violate those just basic inherent rights to your life, your liberty, and your right of freedom of association. The state comes in and says, what wage can you earn? The state comes in how you can produce your product. The state comes in and says, how can you associate with others? What words now? There can be word crimes. Canada has word crimes. And all of these things are the powers of the state to infringe upon people's liberty and freedom. If you get the state out of this and you have the liberal democracy of the widest latitude of individual autonomy and civil society, and the narrowest of government, where government just secures your rights through the democratic election of representatives to do so, you don't have this. But the more that the government becomes unlimited, well, we have to get into the healthcare business. We have to decide on abortion. We have to decide on curriculum in schools. We have to decide on your pension. We have to decide on your healthcare. We have to decide on your housing. We have to decide. Then what is left with you? And just let me, if I can add one other thing. And I say this to my students when we sometimes discuss this in class. I ask them, think of the politician who you hate the most and trust the least. Okay? And I ask all of you in your own minds to do that. Think of the politician you hate the most and you trust the least. Imagine that he's now in control of all these political powers. It's always a two-edged sword because you never know whether your guy is going to be in power.
Okay, so here's the problem. And I'm sorry to sound like a practical person when I'm supposed to be the wild-eyed revolutionary. But, Richard, we're not going to get to the 19th century British system. We've got the system that was developed over the entire 20th century with a panoply of government regulations. So the real issue is not, can we go back to a pristine sort of Eden? The problem is, in this very imperfect version, who do we want in control? Because somebody is in control. The hopes that you might have, which, you know, maybe theoretically would win the day if everybody listened. It's not going to happen. We've got the system we have now. And it seems to me that the system where there is a whole set of government regulations, where there are a whole set of activities by government, the people who do the controlling, which we can control with our votes, that's what is going to happen. What you are asking for would basically require a constitutional amendment. And, you know, you can't, it's virtually impossible to amend the Constitution. So on a practical level, like, who's going to be the next president? We're talking about, from your perspective, a bunch of bad choices. But from my perspective, some choices are so bad, they're tending us down the rabbit hole towards fascism and totalitarianism. And so I want to know, what can we do in the current system, with its flaws, with its, you know, contradictions? What can we do there to defend the rights we still have? That's my sort of response to what I hear you saying, and I sympathize with a lot of what you say about this. But for a practical reason, it's virtually impossible to imagine that happening soon. Maybe in 20 years, if you get to convince everybody over the 20 years that that kind of liberalism is really preferable to the government organizations that we have had in this country, let's say since World War II, or maybe even since World War I.
It sounds like we've put our finger on an important difference of opinion between you. Professor Meeropol, you're suggesting that the threat to liberal democracy is the abuse of government power. Professor Eberling, you're saying the problem is government power itself.
And if I could just add one
Please.
thing. Michael's point is, well, don't we need to be practical? Lesser of two evils. The analogy that puts in my mind is, imagine that it's 1820 or 1830 or 1840. Oh, you're never going to get rid of slavery. It's so embedded in the society. What a pie-in-the-sky dreamer. You know what? We have to elect people who want a kinder and gentler slavery. Pass legislation that the slave owner has to give the slave a better house to live in, a little bit more time on the weekend off. No, it's wrong, it's evil. The goal is to abolish it. And guess what? It ended up being abolished in one sense, in one person's lifetime.
Yeah, well, you are, of course, 1,000% right. But you really need to convince a lot of people. If you may recall, the reason slavery got abolished was not because abolitionists won the day. It was because the South seceded, and the only way Lincoln could win the Civil War was to arm the ex-slaves. Lincoln himself, you could say, was dragged kicking and screaming towards abolition. It took the Civil War, and if there were a Civil War today, it would be fought with a lot more dangerous weapons.
Well, I just remind you that in the case of Great Britain, they ended slavery in the British Empire in 1833, and it wasn't a civil war. It was the power of ideas, starting with the Anti-Slavery League of the second half of the 18th century. And it worked such a point that in 1833, by an act of Parliament, peacefully, the entire slave system was abolished with one signing of an act through Parliament, and gone, without one loss of a life. The power of ideas.
At the various local areas, they figured out a way to make sure that it was a lot slower than that, right? Like in Jamaica, et cetera.
I'd like to ask each of you to say a little bit more about your diagnosis of the threat of the problem. So,
Okay.
Professor Maripol, could I start with you? Your view, as I understand it, is that the problem is the abuse of government power in the ways that you described. So could you say, where does that tendency come from? What are the origins of that threat?
Okay. Well, now, all right. Hello. All right. This could be a sort of, I'll try not to make this long, but I actually attended a session of the American Historical Association in January. The panel's topic was, is there a threat of fascism in the United States? And they had a whole bunch of historians talking about it. And I came away from the idea that there's kind of a four-legged stool of popular view in the United States that is looking for a man on a white horse to solve our problems and to defeat the threats to what they see as American democracy. And what I see this group of people consists of three groups that I am not very pleased with. First of all, there still are people out there who never got satisfied with the end of slavery, the end of Reconstruction, and the end of Jim Crow. So the unreconstructed racists, they're out there still. Second, the extraordinarily angry religious conservatives who can't stand the idea that women gained control over their own body with Roe v. Wade, where gay people had the rights to come out of the closet and be themselves, where people who are very, very different with different lifestyles got to be full citizens. So those people hate it, and they want to send the women back into the kitchen. They want to send gay people back into the closet. Finally, there are billionaires who are very insulted that a lot of us criticize them after the financial meltdown for giving each other bonuses. And they not only want their billions, they also want to be lauded for it, to be celebrated because they earned it. Well, a lot of them inherited it. They didn't earn it. But then there's a fourth group that is completely blameless. These are people who have been left behind by what I call neoliberalism, the economic structure that became embedded in this country in the early 1980s that produced tremendous increases in inequality, tremendous increases in the wealth of the top 1%. And they are sick and tired of being left behind. They are sick and tired of being abandoned by the so-called party of the people, the Democrats. And they also are looking for a man on a white horse. The problem is the man on the white horse is Donald Trump and his enablers, including Stephen Miller, who is the author of The Separating Children from Their Parents at the Border, a man who he's Jewish. And from my perspective, he's a Jew like the Kapos in the concentration camps. He's that much of a horrendous human being. And he will control the rounding up of so-called illegals and putting them in camps and then shipping them out off the border. Those are the people that I fear. Those are the policies that I fear. There are scads of recommendations in Project 2025, and that is why I really do fear what the United States will look like after November.
Professor Ebeling, if your diagnosis,
Notice, only a handful of people applauded.
Professor Ebeling, if your diagnosis is that government power itself is the problem, how would you explain the origins of that problem? Where does that problem come from?
It's the growth of government over the last 125 years. The fact is that the idea that the government control these affairs. Look, Michael and I agree on a variety of certain core issues. A woman's body is to control herself. The state, regardless of pressure groups, should not be involved in this. People should not be able to have new laws imposing segregation. All those peoples are beyond the pale and have no place in either of our views. But the fact is that these problems arise precisely because the state is involved in this. Now, he expressed the border problems. Well, I happen to be a person who believes in the right of free movement of people. Most of the people in this room, if you have any knowledge of your family history, how did you get here? It's because a grandparent or a great-grandparent or a great-great-grandparent came here as an immigrant. And throughout
Except for those who came enslaved.
Except the slaves. But the point is that the vast majority of people in this country are the descendants of people who came here of free choice. And in the 19th and early 20th century, when you're ready for this, there were no passports and no visas. You bought a ticket, if you were poor, maybe in steerage, you crossed the Atlantic, you got off at a place like Ellis Island in New York. They checked you to see if you had a contagious disease or not. You got on board a ferry, you got to South Manhattan in New York City, and guess what? Welcome to America. I see no difference in the vast majority of the people who are coming here today than our ancestors were in the past. The only thing different is that they look a little different. Who cares? But the state is involved in this. And both Democrats and Republicans talk about, oh, there's need for border control. Oh, there has to be a sifting up. This is population planning. This is government central planning of who's going to be allowed to come in, how many, for what type of categories. This is just another form of socialist population control. This is a dangerous thing, and in that, both Mike and I agree. These controls are dangerous. But where else are there these dangers? It comes from the fact that government wants to regulate the economy, and both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump want to do it. I'm an economist. I'll be happy to sit down with Donald Trump and give him a remedial lesson on international trade. Now, his views on protectionism and control of where jobs will be created, what industries will be subsidized, what will be allowed, what will be penalized, is absolute nonsense, both from a freedom point of view and an economic efficiency point of view.
Agreed.
But so are the people in the progressive movement. They want to extend their control over your economic and social life. They want to have this power to say, well, you know, you're not really an individual anymore. You're your gender group, you're your ethnic group, your racial group. This becomes the new eugenics, where you are no longer an individual with individual rights and respected and viewed as an individual, but you're now a tribal group. And now we're going to determine these are the job quotas, these are the employment quotas, this is the income amount allowed, by dividing us up into ethnic and gender tribes. Away with that. The ideal of America, separate from most other countries throughout the world, was the idea that you're not a member of a religion or a class or a race, you're an individual. That's what the Declaration says. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and remember, men meant everybody, all men are created equal with those same rights. These are universal rights. It doesn't talk about American colonists. In principle, these are the universal truths for every human being on the planet. And that should not be lost of in this new tribalism, which the left is propagating.
Well, let us also remember that even as Jefferson wrote the words, he didn't really believe it because he believed that black people were inherently inferior. And that was one of the problems of the Declaration of Independence. It's kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod. Yes, all people are created equal, but women had their place, right? And property owners were more capable of exercising the democratic rights that all people were supposed to have, and so only property owners had the right to vote. And yes, Congress could not establish a national religion, but states could still establish state religions. It took the 14th Amendment to make the Bill of Rights apply to all states. So even at that time, the principle of the Declaration of Independence, which is a beautiful principle, was honored in the breach.
Without getting too far on this, it's important to realize that the 1700s and the 1800s is a bridge between two epochs in human history. The first epoch is the era of slavery. Every society, every continent, every civilization had slavery. It didn't matter what your color was. It didn't matter who you were. We conquered you. We didn't kill you. You're our slave now. The ancient Greeks enslaved each other. The Romans enslaved all of the people they conquered. The ancient Chinese, the Incas, the Aztecs, African tribes. How do you think the slaves got to the African coast to be sold to the Europeans? Other African tribes conquered them and then put them up at the auction block. Slavery was pervasive. The 17 and the 1800s was a period in which it now became concretized and as a moral ideal that people should not own each other. So you had this transition period of two conflicting visions of man, society, and the world. And people inside themselves were often divided. It is not always right to judge everyone of the past by what we now consider true. Because just remember, 100 years from now, there'll be people who look back on us and say, how could they have believed that nonsense? So, yes, Jefferson had slaves, but he also attempted to have slavery ended in the legislature of Virginia, and it failed by just a few votes. He was conflicted. People were conflicted. It took a lot of things to overcome. We're now overcoming such ideas and prejudices. And other people in the future will look back on us and say, why did it take them so long? But it is the human reality of things.
I think it might be fair to say, thinking in terms of electoral politics, that few Americans would describe themselves as Marxist, and few would vote for a libertarian candidate for president. What I'm saying is that the views that you're both expressing very cogently, they don't seem to be majority views among American voters. So here's my question. What is it, in your assessment, that American voters are missing? Why are they mistaken?
Well, I mean, my argument would be that the example of the Soviet Union probably set back the cause of socialism for generations, maybe forever. So anybody who would like to go beyond private ownership of wealth-producing property has to invent the wheel. And there are people in the United States who have programs. There's a guy I know taught at UMass. You actually debated him once, Richard, is Rick Wolf. He has a program which he calls Democracy at Work. And his idea is that workers, groups of workers owning their own firms, such as some of the software companies in California before individuals came to dominate them. That's the sort of germ of the new society, just as the small capitalist enterprises in Venice were the germ of the new society in the middle of European feudalism. And his hope is that by example, and the idea that we should extend democracy to the workplace so that the owner is not the king, is not the emperor of the workplace, but is part of a democratically controlled workplace. He said, if that ever catches on, that will be the way a society like the United States is transformed. I have hopes that that might work, but I've come to the conclusion that the best way to improve society is incrementally. So I would consider myself, or a true Marxist would probably consider me a renegade social democratic revisionist, because I'm much more interested in liberal moves a little bit at a time to make life a little bit better. And unfortunately, from Richard's point of view, I'm making it worse, because I'm calling for government to make the kind of regulations it did, for example, when it passed with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I would like to see the PRO Act, which helps balance the odds between would-be unionized people and their companies who are trying desperately to keep unions out. Those are the kinds of things I would like to see. And I would like to see, obviously, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, to get back to the spirit of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as opposed to the kinds of things that are happening in some states that are really horribly anti-democratic. Now, I know from Richard's point of view, the very existence of state power is the problem with democracy, and that's where we disagree. But from my perspective, I'd like to see some positive steps forward. And by the way, many of these steps, for example, increased climate change regulation, increased environmental regulation, these are things that, if they are implemented and if they work, are actually going to save my grandchildren from 4 degrees or 6 degrees Celsius in 50 years. So those are the kinds of things I'd like to see. And a lot of the incremental reforms are actually quite popular, but they can't win because of the nature of the way Congress is set up, the nature of gerrymandering, which creates state legislatures. Here in North Carolina, right? You're a 50-50 state, and you've almost got supermajorities in your legislature. What's up with that? That's not real democracy. Those are the kinds of things I would like to see changed a little bit at a time. And as I said, my Marxism is more analytical about the United States. It's not revolutionary. It's not Leninist, and they'd read me out of a party if I were in one.
I have nothing wrong with incremental changes. I would love to see marginal tax rates lowered. I'd like to see a variety of industries and occupations deregulated. I'd love to see the end of the minimum wage law, so people who are unskilled and poor can have a chance to get their foot on the bottom rung of the ladder when their value added to the firm is so low that the minimum wage makes them priced out of the market. I would love those incremental changes. But I will admit that I look at this from not just the economic efficiency point of view, but from an ethical point of view. Why should the government have the authority, whether a king or a majority, to manage your life? Let's suppose that a majority says that they think that Johnny should have the government pay for his dentistry visit, and Aunt Minnie should have her subsidized apartment. And that fellow there is going to be taxed to pay for it. Now, let's assume he's been honest. He's never defrauded anybody. He's earned his money merely by making the better mousetrap that people wanted to buy. And now they say, you're going to have to pay for this. And he says, I've earned my money honestly. I'm willing to pay for the policeman, the court, a few soldiers at the border for national defense. But what are you doing with all of this other money of mine? I don't want to do it. And they now say, if you don't, we will confiscate your wealth. And if you resist, you're open to, and subject to arrest. And if you resist arrest, we can use force. And if you keep resisting, under certain stipulations, we can use lethal force.
I'm shooting you with a gun, Richard.
So I ask this. So what makes Johnny's dentistry visit or Aunt Minnie's subsidized government apartment more important than that other person, his life or his liberty, who's honestly earned the money that they want to expropriate for him? It's either force or freedom. At the ultimate end of the day, you could argue and work on these increments of this direction or that direction. But the question is, what is the foundation of a society? Force or freedom? Voluntarism or coercion? That is at the basis of this. Increasingly unlimited democracy, that the majority can get anything they want, or an extremely limited liberal democracy where there's this wide range of your freedoms and your free associations with people, and this narrow range of what government does merely to secure your freedom and not violate and abuse it.
Well, this is an argument that we probably have heard before, but obviously there's a big restriction in freedom every time you come upon a red light. Imagine if there were no lights. Yes, a lot of times people would get through the intersection, but it's actually protecting the freedom of all those drivers from being smashed by another driver to have red lights, and red lights restrict freedom. There are a whole host of examples like that in the real world that suggest that when you have a lot of people living together in close proximity and working together and following their dreams and pursuing individual opportunities, there's a lot of opportunity for some people to take advantage of others. I mean, neither of us are anarchists, so we're not going to say there should be no police force. But your point is the police should have very limited roles. And my view in terms of economic justice is that actually there is a very robust role, and it's a problem. I mean, your example of Aunt Minnie needing her teeth and somebody who runs a business financing those teeth, that's a system that goes all the way back to the 1880s and 1890s in Germany, the system of social insurance. Now, as I'm sure you know, Richard, that's not socialism. Social insurance is a bargain between people in order to make sure that, for example, if I am disabled and I cannot take care of myself and my family cannot take care of themselves, all the people who won and are not disabled chip in a little bit, coerced to chip in a little bit to take care of me and my disability. If I outlive my savings and I retire, everybody who is working pays towards my retirement, buys a stake in their retirement. That's the system of social insurance. It is a bargain between society. If you win and you're not disabled and you're not unemployed and you haven't outlived your saving, you get to pay for other people who are not as lucky as you. The system of social insurance, which starts with Bismarck in Germany, I think it has stood all the advanced countries of the world in good stead. And yes, it does restrict freedom, but it enhances the freedom to life and the pursuit of happiness of everybody else. It's an insurance policy, but it's an insurance policy that isn't voluntary based on ability to pay. It's an insurance policy that we in society make with each other. And I know you disagree with it because we've talked about this before.
The time has come for questions
God,
from the
give
audience.
Richard a chance to
Okay.
answer.
Okay, please.
First, it was started in Bismarck's Germany in the 1880s and 1990s. And he did it as a pragmatic matter because the Social Democrats were winning elections in the German parliament, the Reichstag. And he told Americans who ended up being progressives why he did this. You can read about these in a lot of books. He said, I wanted to bribe the people to vote for us instead of the socialists. It was a pragmatic power-lusting thing for the powers that be. But the fact is that an insurance policy is something that I agreed to take out. I have dog insurance. I sometimes wish I had my dog's insurance. It seemed like a better deal in terms of the benefits. My dog has insurance. I have life insurance. I have auto insurance. I have home insurance. I can have any of other varieties of insurance, okay? But the fact is, these are voluntary things. I make a decision for myself and my family, given our desires, our preferences, our goals and purposes, and the constraints of our incomes, how we're going to apportion our income, the degree of risk we want to take, the amount that we're willing to pay as a premium or not. But this is compulsory. What if I don't want the government's Social Security? What if I don't want the government's health care programs? What if I want to opt out? That goes back to my question. What if I say no? Are you going to be throwing me in jail for refusing to pay? Are you going to kill me if I resist arrest? That is the ultimate issue. Who makes these decisions? You, as individual human beings, your own judgments, your own values, your own estimates of what's important and worth paying for in your life, rather than others saying, I know what's good for you. And in fact, you'd appreciate it if you're only as wise as myself to know what's good for you. And I'm going to use the power of the state to teach you to be as good as I think you should be.
And I will not respond, Richard,
Thank you.
but I do have an answer.
So the time has come for questions. We gave members of the Carolina Alumni Association the opportunity to submit questions in advance. Many of them are watching the live stream right now. And so I wanted to start our Q&A with a question that was submitted in advance by one of our alumni. So here's the question. Given the threats to liberal democracy that you've identified, what can a public university like UNC do to try to address some of those threats or to strengthen liberal democracy in the United States?
Get students to read. I just read an article online that says that there are an awful lot of kids who graduate from high school who've never read a book from cover to cover. I think bringing back reading is probably the most important thing that could be done for anything, let alone liberal democracy. And I'm not trying to be snarky. I think it's, a love of books and learning and trying to figure things out for yourself is the sine qua non of democracy.
I know I'm supposed to be neutral here, but I would say I couldn't agree more.
And I would say, is that not only the importance of reading in general, but in the place of a university, a college, particularly in courses on history, political science, some economics, political economy, and so on, even literature in terms of an historical context, I think it's important if the students are reading original documents, they should read the Declaration of Independence, all of it, not just the opening famous line we all know. What were the enumerated grievances? That's the basic of the document. The Constitution, the Federalist Papers by Madison, Jay, and Hamilton in making the case for the Constitution, but also have the students read a selection of the anti-Federalist Papers. What did the critics of the Constitution say? Have them read these things and have them debate them and think about them, and think about the concepts, the ideas, the principles, the ideals in them in the context of contemporary issues. What is still there, what has been lost, what has been changed, and why, and has it been good or bad?
And I would go further and say that some of those amendments, like the 14th Amendment and the 15th, certainly the 14th Amendment, because there's so much argument about what it means. Just the simple thing, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. There are people who want to get rid of birthright citizenship. They want to say, well, the people who drafted it didn't mean the children of illegal aliens. Well, yes, they did, because there were no such thing as illegal aliens in the 1800s.
Let's open it up to questions from our audience. We have about 25 minutes, so I'd like to call on a couple of students to pose their questions at a time. We'll take 2 questions at once and then give our panelists a chance to respond. So I believe we have one question in front, up towards the front, please.
Hi. First of all, I'm a teacher at CHCCS, so thanks for the shout out for reading. Yeah, go reading, man. So my question is, we've seen in 2016, kind of the role of foreign actors in disinformation campaigns in our elections. And now I think a big concern is obviously the rise of generative AI and kind of the influx of disinformation that AI can give both from domestic sources and foreign sources. But obviously, the restriction of disinformation and stuff would take government intervention. So I'd kind of like to hear both your opinions on, I guess, where does that lie about either, the restriction of disinformation, but at the same time that inherently to restrict it, the state has to get involved because you would have to create a law for it. So kind of where does that boundary lie for both of you?
Thank you. One more question, please.
Hi, thank you both so much for speaking. It was very enlightening. My name is Noah. I'm a junior at UNC here. And I'm curious about, I'm sure both of you are familiar with Ta-Nehisi Coates' seminal article called The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic, which obviously has received a lot of criticism and both accolade over the past several years. And I'm curious from perhaps both a libertarian perspective and a more Marxist perspective, what both of your thoughts are on the idea of kind of government-issued or government-regulated reparations. I think one could make the case that even though they would be imposed by the government, that they might actually liberate people from having to have as much government intervention in the market because there would be more equity and equality. But I think you could also make the case from a Marxist perspective that you need it because of the historical inequities. So I'm curious what both of you think on that.
You want to start?
Yeah. I'll take the last question first. I'll take the last question first. I just had the pleasure of spending some time with the Duke economist William Darity Jr., who has been working for the last 5 to 10 years on a legitimate, well-developed idea on how to engage in reparations. And I know there are many people who would argue that it is absurd to think of reparations because, for example, every person who is paying taxes today had nothing to do with slavery. On the other hand, if you use the analysis that Dr. Darity mentions, there have been advantages that have accrued to people over the years, advantages in terms of blacks and whites having different levels of wealth and things like that, that suggest that the legacy, not just of slavery, but of Jim Crow itself, which is many, many more years past the end of slavery, does suggest that this would be a fabulous way of closing the wealth gap. So I highly recommend the work of William Darity Jr. You can look it up. It's very well developed, and it would be a great idea. And I don't know if it's from a Marxist perspective, but it's certainly from, in my opinion, an ethical perspective, that our society can, in one fell swoop, they don't have to create all these laws about, affirmative action, of subsidies for black-owned businesses, et cetera, et cetera. You just make a wealth transfer. In fact, Richard, I don't know if you were in favor of this. There was an argument in the 19th century that suggested that the best way to have a liberal democracy was to, every generation or so, have a jubilee of redistributing wealth as a way of giving everybody a level playing field to start. And I don't know how many actual liberal economists supported this or not, but I remember that was one of the arguments of how to make liberal democracy fair every generation. This would be a way of dealing with the generational inequalities that have stemmed from particularly Jim Crow. So yes, I'm 100% in favor of that.
I don't believe in reparations in this context. I think that those Jews who survived the Holocaust or their immediate relatives certainly had a right to have their property returned to them, homes, businesses, works of art, money, etc. And the same way as if you can catch someone who's stolen your television, you get your TV back. But we're talking about history now, and a nuance and a complexity that has no simplistic answer. My grandparents on both sides came here at the beginning of the 20th century as little kids. On my father's side, they were Germans and Irish, and they were escaping from the circumstances of their low income status and wanted a better life. My mother's family were Lithuanian and Russian Jews. They were escaping from pogroms and from the Cossacks going in and killing people. And they came here long after slavery ended. My mother's side of the family experienced anti-Semitism. My grandfather couldn't get into medical school, he had to become a pharmacist. My mother would tell me that in the 1930s, she still remembers seeing ads in New York newspapers where they were living said, Jews need not apply. What the hell have they got to do with something that happened 150 years ago? What happens to those descendants of whites who helped with the Underground Railroad? Do they get a discount? Because their ancestors were helping slaves get to Canada and away from slavery. What about those blacks who were able to pass for white and did very well in society? Do they have to pay an extra surcharge because they got away from that punishment of the slave society? You could have all these permutations and nuances in which questions of justice and rightness. Do the sins of the father fall upon the son? This is what amounts to. The point is that that's long ago. And there were inequities and injustices. You could say that about numerous instances of this throughout history. Do the Italians of today owe reparations to all of the people, the descendants of the people that they controlled under their empire 2,000 years ago? At what point does this stop? I think it is better to accept the fact that some injustices belong to people on both sides who are long dead and just move on from there. And if you feel that there is opportunities to help those who are less fortunate than yourself, who may be the descendants of slaves and certain carryover of misfortunes. In my view, as a classical liberal, as a libertarian, that is the purpose of charity, philanthropy, the associations that Alexis de Tocqueville talked about in Democracy of America, in which he said one of the most amazing things about America is that the constant formation of these free associations to pursue good causes. If you believe it, find others who share that with you and do so as you think it's deserved for those people who you think can be helped. expending your own money. It's very easy to spend other people's money.
Would you like to address the first question about disinformation and communications technology?
Yes, okay. I don't believe in any of these regulations. Do people say false things, fraudulent things, incorrect things? Do they exaggerate the truth? Do they distort the truth? That's been going on since the beginning of time. Read the news, some of the newspapers at the beginning of the 19th century in American politics. What people like John Adams said about Thomas Jefferson, and the papers that supported Thomas Jefferson, what they said about John Adams. Talk about character attacks. Talk about exaggerations and mistruths about each other. Each had their desire to see that the legislation and the government was in the hands of either the Federalists or the Anti-Federalists. And all this went on. Now there's a new technology. It's more sophisticated. It can be more effective in some ways, but it is very dangerous to start down a path. It's like the camel's nose in the tent. When you say, well, surely everybody would agree that that's misinformation. Like beauty, misinformation is almost always in the eyes of the beholder. It is better to have government out of this completely. And if you think lies and misinformations or fake news is being presented, then it calls upon you and others to correct those errors. That's how open discourse and debate really should go on.
The really serious problem arises from the fact, and I'm going to give you a statement by former Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a former Harvard professor. He then went on to be ambassador to the UN, and he served many years in the United States Senate. He very famously once said, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. Well, guess what? Now in the era of news silos and AI and TikTok and Instagram, everybody's entitled to their own facts. And everybody's entitled to believe their own facts, and they can spend their entire lives not hearing any other facts. Is there a solution to that? It certainly isn't government, because government can, yes, sometimes deal with specific things, but most of the time they just do what they want to present as facts. The only solution to disinformation is more information. You hear something that's false, call it a lie, get it out there. Be courageous. It's rough, and let's face it, some people have much louder megaphones than others. Anybody who speaks on Fox News is going to have a much larger megaphone than I do with my 4 minutes on a public radio station twice a week, or even Richard, who probably has a much bigger megaphone than I do. But you got to try, and that, in my opinion, is the only solution. There is no government solution to fake news and disinformation. Now, exposure, it may be that if, in fact, we learn that something is the propaganda result of a foreign country, I think that's legitimate to expose it, but it should be based on people doing the exposure. We should not rely on government to tell us this is true, this is not true. Because in the era of my parents, when there were a whole bunch of people trying to save their lives and make a point about the unfairness of the judge and about the fact that there were just a couple of witnesses against them who were co-conspirators, the public never even knew the arguments on our side because the government, in effect, influenced the media to have a line. And the line in those days was anti-communism. And anti-communism on some level was a good thing in terms of exposing the nature of the Soviet regime, which I'm sorry to say a lot of American communists, probably my own parents, ignored to their detriment. But exposing the idea that anybody who would say anything in favor of socialism suddenly doesn't deserve the protection of the Bill of Rights because, as a couple of Supreme Court justices have said, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And what does that mean? It means when it really matters, the government can override the Constitution, as when Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War, and when we interned Japanese Americans during World War II, and when, yes, the government killed my parents.
I'll just say that we totally agree on this. And I'll tell you one other thing, the pressure of government. There were people who did not want to testify in the House Un-American Activities Committee, who were accused of being communists. Some might have gone to communist meetings in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Some of them might have actually belonged to the party for a while. Who cares? But the government tried to put pressure, especially on the movie industry, for a blacklist. And people who may have just had those youthful, little episodes ended up not being able to be scriptwriters, actors, and that shows that just government influence over these matters can destroy people's lives. That's why government should be kept at very arm's length.
We have time for a few more questions from the audience.
Okay, I think I was first. Hi, so my name is Caroline. I'm a junior. I'm majoring in political science and economics. I was going to pose a question. I just want to make sure I pronounce your name right. It's Dr. Maripol?
Not miracle.
No, Maripol.
As in the maple.
Okay, cool. That's awesome. Okay, so along ideological lines, I would definitely consider myself a liberal. So when you were talking about like climate change and voting rights, like I very passionately agreed with you, and I really appreciate you for speaking out on those issues. However, as an economics major, I also like believe in like free markets, and I'm very hesitant about nationalizing a lot of industries. So as a Marxist, I'm a little bit hesitant to agree with you on the solution to a lot of these issues would be nationalization. So am I correct in assuming that those are your views? And if so, how would you convince someone like me who agrees with you that these issues are very big issues that need addressing and that nationalization is the solution to these issues? Because Ebling, he's a libertarian, I can see his point of view as an economics major, but in terms of the culture war, I was very turned off by a lot of his point of view, if I'm being completely honest. But on the other hand, in terms of Marxism, there's a lot that I don't understand that I would like to understand in terms of economics. Thank you.
Let's take two more questions.
Hi, I'd like to say thank you both for coming here. And neither of you self-described as a Democrat or Republican. What are your thoughts on the two-party system?
Thanks. And last question.
Well, two statements of principle. Remember, democracy is not a spectator sport, and we get the government and politics that we deserve.
So 3 points, 3 questions. Would you like to respond?
Well, I'll respond to the first. I will respond to the first question. I myself, given that I believe that a modern version of socialism involves democracy in the workplace, I'm not a big fan of nationalization. And when the British Labour Party took over Great Britain, and they nationalized the coal mines, and they nationalized the railroads, and they tried to nationalize the steel industry, they didn't take any steps towards socialism. The idea that goes all the way back to the Russian Revolution, that when you take power, you seize the commanding heights of industry and use that to control the economy. I don't see that at all. In fact, I see, and the person whose writings I like the most is a man named Garo Perovitz, who wrote articles about what he called democratic decentralized socialism. I see a decentralized system where at the workplace there's democracy, at the county level there's democracy, at the state level there's democracy, and that's how industry gets organized. I am, as I've made it clear, in opposition to the private ownership of wealth-producing property because it produces too much power on the part of those wealth holders. That's where Richard and I don't disagree. But we do agree, neither of us would be in favor of nationalization by any means. I think it would be, in the United States, it would probably be a step backwards. I mean, hey, we have certain nationalized industries. We have Amtrak. Is Amtrak running any better than if it were a private company? I'm not sure, et cetera. So I'll stop there and talking about nationalization.
Okay, I'll just say is that on this, I believe that in the type of liberal free society that I would like to see, workers can combine their resources, their savings, and own a company, worker-owned companies. But that would be one form of ownership, and a diversity and decentralized forms of others. Some person wants to use his own savings or the borrowed savings of others and start his own business and hire those on mutually agreed upon terms to be employees of his and contract with others to produce for him the means of production, the forms of capital equipment that he houses in his factory, with which the workers he freely contracted with to be using in the production of a product that he then sells to consumers, which will then determine whether he makes a profit or a loss, based upon whether the consumers choose to buy it or not. I have no problem with that. But the idea that there should be one size fits all, every industry, every sector of the economy should be worker managed. Why? Workers can do this anytime they want. How many worker managed firms do you see? Most people don't want that headache. It didn't work very well in admittedly an imperfect form in Yugoslavia in the 1960s and 70s. So yes, you can have worker managed firms. It shouldn't be forced or compelled about as the method. One other point. As I see the liberal view, and mine is what is traditionally called the classical liberal view of the 19th and early 20th century, I'm neither conservative nor modern liberal. Why do I say that? I'm not a conservative because I'm a strong believer, as we've been talking about, civil liberties, individual autonomy, owning your own body, men and women, freedom of speech. But at the same time, I'm not on the left, because I believe that people have the same latitude and rights of liberty in their economic affairs. It's a seamless tapestry that is woven together, and it's called the different facets of human freedom. So the liberal view believes all freedom, civil and economic. And yes, democracy is not a spectator sport, and it's important for all of us to express our views, share our views, discuss with each other, and even argue and debate with each other. And the future will determine where the country goes.
And when you mentioned democracy is not a spectator sport, I'm very glad you brought that up, because I live in New York State. My vote for president will not matter. I might as well not vote, because it's a foregone conclusion. You people in North Carolina, I know you are inundated with ads, and I know you must be sick and tired of watching television or listening to the radio or even opening a newspaper. But that's a small price to pay for the fact that every one of you North Carolinians are going to be helping decide the future of this country, because you are in a purple state. You are in a 50-50 state. You are in a swing state. Now, I would abolish the Electoral College tomorrow and have a popular vote for president. I think that that was an absolutely awful part of the Constitution. But we're stuck with it, and it ain't going to change. And since we're stuck with it, you people have a tremendous opportunity. So if there's anybody in this room who is thinking of not voting, please change your mind. I don't care who you vote for. You can vote for a fifth party. You can vote for one of the two parties. But take a role to play that a large part of your fellow citizens in this country don't have. I think, Richard, if you vote in South Carolina, that's a foregone conclusion as well. It just is the way it is. So two-party system. If it were up to me, we would have a parliamentary system with multiple parties, and we would have ranked choice voting, so that you could vote for a party you liked, even though it was very small, and then you'd end up voting for one of the major parties. The two-party system, in my opinion, is a vehicle by which rich people tell the rest of us who to vote for. And they, controlling either party, control the government. Yes, of course, there are differences. There are very significant differences. Sometimes they're smaller, sometimes they're larger. But I would prefer a multiple parliamentary system with multiple parties.
I would just say is that the one electoral change I like to see is that on every ballot, there's candidate A, candidate B, candidate C, and then none of the above. And if none of the above gets a plurality, that office remains vacant for that term. You know what? We'll not notice any difference, other than they're leaving us alone in terms of what that person would have done if he held that office.
Well done, Richard.
We have unfortunately reached the end of our discussion this evening. The last thing I'll say, please join me in offering a round of applause for our two wonderful speakers this evening.